Vickie Lynn Deblieux was born on April 18, 1956, in West Monroe, Louisiana. She grew up in Ouachita Parish and would later be remembered by her family as spirited, funny, and someone who lived with a free sense of independence. By the early 1990s, she was in her 30s, raising 2 children, and like many people, facing the challenges of everyday life while trying to stay connected with her loved ones. In February of 1994, Vickie was planning to travel back to her mother's home in West Monroe, Louisiana. She had been staying with friends in Tennessee, but her goal was simple: to make it home safely to see her family. Money was tight, and she did not have reliable transportation for the long trip ahead. That left her with the difficult decision to hitchhike, something that carried risks, but was still not uncommon at that time. On the evening of February 21st, a friend dropped her off near Chattanooga, Tennessee, close to Interstate 59. From there, she intended to find a ride that would take her west and south toward Louisiana. Hitchhiking was often unpredictable, but to Vickie, it may have felt like the only option she had to continue her journey. That evening was the last time anyone who loved her saw her alive. She was 37 years old, standing on the roadside with her luggage, determined to get to her mother's house. What she could not have known was that in the hours ahead, her path would cross with a group of teenagers in Jefferson County, Alabama, whose actions would forever change the course of her life. This chance encounter, beginning as an offer of help to a stranded traveler, would instead set into motion one of the most disturbing crimes in Alabama's history. As Vickie Deblieux made her way along Interstate 59 in Jefferson County, Alabama, she accepted what appeared to be a simple offer of help. The ride came from 4 local teenagers who were out driving together that night. They were Carrie Dale Grayson, who was 19, Kenneth Loggins, who was 17, Trace Duncan, who was also 17, and Louis Mangione, who was only 16. The group had spent the evening drinking alcohol and using drugs before they came across Vickie standing on the roadside. The 4 young men told her they could take her to Louisiana, which must have sounded like the exact break she needed to finally reach her family. She got into their vehicle, likely believing she had found kindness and a safe way forward, but their intentions were far from genuine. Instead of following the highway toward the state line, the teenagers steered their van toward a remote wooded area in the Jefferson County. They claimed they needed to stop and pick up another vehicle, a story that kept Vickie from suspecting what was truly about to happen. When they arrived at the isolated location, the atmosphere quickly shifted. What had begun as a promise of transportation turned into intimidation. The teenagers' behavior became hostile, and the situation grew more dangerous with each passing moment. In that secluded place, far from the interstate and any source of help, Vickie realized too late that she had placed her trust in the wrong hands. The hours that followed would mark the beginning of a crime that shocked not only Jefferson County, but eventually the entire country. It was there, in those dark Alabama woods, that the encounter took its irreversible turn from a supposed act of goodwill to a horrifying betrayal that left Vickie Deblieux with no way out. For several days after February 22nd of 1994, Vickie Deblieux's family had no idea where she was. She had disappeared somewhere between Tennessee and Louisiana, and with no phone call or sign of her arrival, concern quickly turned to fear. Her loved ones waited for answers, unaware that investigators in Alabama would soon uncover a grim truth. On February 26th, 4 days after her disappearance, a group of rock climbers exploring Bald Rock Mountain in St. Clair County made a shocking discovery at the base of a bluff. They spotted human remains and immediately alerted law enforcement. When deputies and investigators arrived, they faced a crime scene that made it clear this was no accident. The condition of the body showed evidence of extreme violence, and detectives knew immediately they were dealing with a homicide. The remains were later confirmed to be those of 37-year-old Vickie Deblieux. Because of the severity of her injuries, traditional identification methods were difficult. Medical examiners relied on dental records and an X-ray comparison of her spine to positively confirm her identity. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, with asphyxiation considered a possible contributing factor. With the victim identified, the focus turned to finding out who was responsible. Investigators began tracing her final known movements and gathering leads. It did not take long for information to surface that pointed directly to a group of local teenagers. Within weeks, Jefferson County authorities learned of disturbing behavior among several youths who had been bragging about a killing. The breakthrough came when word spread that one of the suspects had even shown a severed finger to acquaintances, a grotesque act that horrified those who saw it and quickly reached police. This reckless display provided detectives with the lead they needed. Soon, the names of Carrie Dale Grayson, Kenneth Loggins, Trace Duncan, and Louis Mangione were brought to the attention of investigators. One by one, they were questioned, and the horrifying story of what had happened to Vickie Deblieux began to unfold. By April of 1994, all 4 suspects had been arrested and formally charged with capital murder. The arrests of Carrie Dale Grayson, Kenneth Loggins, Trace Duncan, and Louis Mangione in the spring of 1994 brought the shocking case into Alabama's court system. Because of the brutality of the crime, prosecutors pursued capital murder charges against all 4. Their trials were scheduled separately, stretching across late 1995 and early 1996, each one drawing significant public attention. The first to stand trial was Trace Duncan. In November of 1995, just before his 19th birthday, a jury found him guilty of capital murder. The jury recommended that Duncan should receive the death penalty, and the court scheduled his sentencing for early the following year. Only a few weeks later, in mid-November, Louis Mangione went before a jury. At 16 years old at the time of the crime, he was the youngest of the 4. He too was found guilty, but his age influenced the outcome. The jury chose not to recommend death, instead sentencing him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kenneth Loggins faced trial soon after. His case began later that same month, after delays caused by questions about his mental state. In December of 1995, a jury returned a guilty verdict. 10 of the 12 jurors voted for the death penalty, and the judge followed that recommendation, sentencing Loggins to death. The final trial involved Carrie Dale Grayson, who prosecutors considered the leader of the group. His case opened in late January of 1996. Testimony during the proceedings included statements from a forensic psychologist who noted that Grayson had bipolar disorder and had been in a manic state during the crime. However, the expert clarified that despite his condition, Grayson understood right from wrong. On February 2nd, the jury found him guilty, and just days later, they unanimously recommended the death penalty. On March 8th of 1996, Circuit Judge Mike McCormick finalized the sentences. Mangione was ordered to spend the rest of his life in prison, while Grayson, Loggins, and Duncan were all sentenced to death. These decisions marked the beginning of decades of legal proceedings that would continue to unfold long after the verdicts were announced. After the convictions in 1996, the case of Vickie Deblieux continued to move through the courts for decades. Each of the men pursued appeals, challenging evidence, trial procedures, and sentencing decisions. Because the crime involved juveniles and the death penalty, legal battles stretched on for years, often tied to larger constitutional questions. For Louis Mangione, the youngest of the group, his life without parole sentence eventually came under review. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional. Mangione, who had been only 16 at the time of the crime, was resentenced in 2016 to life with the possibility of parole. This did not guarantee his release, but it meant his case could be revisited in the future. Kenneth Loggins, sentenced to death, remained on Alabama's death row for for nearly 3 decades. His appeals argued against the fairness of the jury's recommendation and raised concerns about his mental health, but none overturned the original outcome. He died in prison in 2022 at the age of 47, still awaiting execution. Trace Duncan, who had also been sentenced to death, continued to pursue appeals into the 2020s. His case remained unresolved in terms of final punishment, though he remained incarcerated under a death sentence. Carrie Dale Grayson, considered by prosecutors to be the ringleader, spent 28 years on death row. His attorneys filed numerous appeals, including claims about his mental health and issues of due process, but these efforts were unsuccessful. On January 25th of 2024, the state of Alabama carried out his execution by lethal injection at Holman Correctional Facility. He was 52 years old. Through all of the legal proceedings, the focus always returned to the loss of Vickie Deblieux. She was remembered by her family as a free-spirited young woman who had been planning to rebuild her life when she encountered 4 strangers on a highway in Alabama. The violence she suffered shocked the community, and her story remains one of the most tragic examples of how a single decision, accepting a ride, changed everything. The case serves as a reminder of the lasting consequences of crime, the grief of a family, the destruction of 4 young men's lives, and the decades-long process of justice. Even 30 years later, the name Vickie Deblieux is still spoken in Alabama as both a cautionary tale and a memory of a life cut short. In the heart of southern Alabama, life in Dothan and the surrounding towns moves at a steady, familiar pace. Summers are warm, nights are quiet, and communities are close-knit, where everyone knows their neighbors and children play freely in the streets. For 17-year-olds J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett, life was full of promise. Both were seniors at Northview High School, known for their energy, friendliness, and involvement in school and community activities. J.B. Beasley was born on July 31st, 1982, in Troy, Alabama. She was a talented dancer, a cheerleader, and a member of the Junior Honor Society. Tracie Hawlett, born on March 3rd, 1982, had experienced the loss of her father at a young age and was very close to her mother. Both girls were inseparable, often spending their free time together, sharing dreams and plans for the future. On the evening of July 31st, 1999, J.B. Beasley's birthday was a cause for celebration. The 2 friends decided to drive to a party in the nearby town of Headland, eager to enjoy the night and mark J.B.'s milestone. J.B. borrowed her family's black 1993 Mazda 929 for the drive. The night started like so many others, with laughter, music, and the carefree excitement only teenagers can feel. But as they left the familiar streets of Dothan, their path took them along winding country roads, unfamiliar and dark. Without modern navigation tools, they became disoriented, eventually arriving in the town of Ozark, roughly 9 miles from their intended destination. Their detour led them to the Big Little Store, a convenience store and gas station on East Broad Street. It was there that they asked for directions, trying to find their way back. Around 11:35 that night, Tracie used a payphone to call her mother, Carol Roberts, explaining that they were lost and seeking guidance. Tracie mentioned that a man at the store had offered to help them find the correct road. Her mother reassured her and instructed her to call back if they needed more help. Tracie promised she would. The conversation would be the last time anyone heard from the girls alive. As the night stretched on, friends and family grew increasingly worried. The party they had planned to attend had no sign of them. Hours passed with no contact, and the quiet streets of Ozark felt heavier, filled with an unspoken tension. Residents began to notice the absence of the girls, their small community unsettled by the thought that something was wrong. Little did anyone know, the night that had begun with celebration was already turning into a tragedy that would leave a permanent mark on the town. The events of that evening set in motion a case that would challenge investigators for years and remain in the hearts of the community for decades to come. By the morning of August 1st, 1999, the worry surrounding J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett had escalated into full-blown alarm. Their families officially reported them missing to the Ozark Police Department, and local authorities immediately began searching the area. Officers canvassed streets, spoke with neighbors, and checked familiar hangouts in and around Ozark. As the sun rose, residents started noticing the small details that something was amiss. A car parked in an unusual spot, a street quieter than normal, and the absence of two familiar teenagers. Around 9 o'clock that morning, a patrol officer spotted the black 1993 Mazda 929 belonging to the Beasley family. It was parked oddly along Herring Avenue, a quiet residential street in Ozark. Inside the vehicle were the girls' personal belongings, including JB's purse and wallet, and Tracie's purse. At first glance, there were no visible signs of violence or struggle. However, the abandoned car raised immediate concern, and investigators quickly secured the scene. Upon opening the trunk, law enforcement discovered the unthinkable. Both J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett had been killed. The discovery shocked the small community. Local police immediately cordoned off the area and called in forensic teams from surrounding counties. Crime scene investigators meticulously documented the scene, taking photographs and collecting evidence that would later prove crucial. The investigation expanded rapidly, with officers interviewing residents, questioning acquaintances, and tracing the girls' last known movements. The initial investigation involved over 500 interviews as detectives tried to reconstruct the events of that night. Authorities examined more than 70 potential suspects, collecting DNA and other forensic evidence wherever possible. Early tips came in from residents claiming knowledge of the case, but many turned out to be false or misleading. Law enforcement established a 24-hour tip line and offered a reward for information, which was later increased with additional funds from Alabama's governor. Despite these efforts, leads continued to run cold, and the case remained unsolved for years. Even though the investigation stalled, police carefully preserved the evidence collected, including DNA samples from J.B. Beasley's clothing. These samples would later become the key to solving the case. The community of Ozark continued to mourn the loss of the two girls, holding vigils and memorials to honor their memory. For decades, the families waited for answers, holding on to the hope that one day justice would be served. Meanwhile, the police continued to re-examine leads and revisit old interviews as new forensic techniques emerged. They consulted with national experts and remained in contact with organizations specializing in cold case investigations. The combination of persistence and the careful preservation of evidence would eventually pave the way for a breakthrough that no one could have imagined back in 1999. Even though the summer of 1999 ended in tragedy, the groundwork laid by the initial investigation kept the hope of resolution alive. The memory of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett remained vivid in the hearts of Ozark residents, serving as a constant reminder of the need for justice and the determination of law enforcement to never give up on a case, no matter how long it takes. For nearly 2 decades, the murders of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett remained one of the most puzzling cold cases in Alabama. While investigators had DNA evidence from the crime scene, it did not match anyone in national criminal databases at the time. Advances in technology and forensic science, however, would soon change the trajectory of the investigation. By the late 20-teens, genetic genealogy had begun proving itself as a revolutionary tool for solving cases that had remained cold for years. In August of 2018, the Ozark Police Department partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in genetic genealogy and DNA analysis. Investigators provided them with the crime scene DNA collected from J.B. Beasley's clothing. Parabon Nanolabs ran the DNA through public genealogy databases to search for potential familial connections. Within months, the analysis produced a match to a distant relative, creating a lead that investigators had never had before. This marked the first significant breakthrough in the case in almost 20 years. Using this familial match, genealogists began painstakingly constructing an extended family tree, tracing generations and connections to identify men who could have been in the Ozark area in 1999. They cross-referenced addresses, employment records, and other public documents, narrowing their focus to a small number of potential suspects. The investigation revealed a man who lived approximately 1 mile from Herring Avenue, the street where the girl's car had been found. This man had no prior criminal record and was known locally as a truck driver and preacher, blending into the community with little to raise suspicion. By March of 2019, law enforcement approached the man, Coley Lewis McCraney, then 45 years old. He was cooperative, providing a voluntary DNA sample that was sent to the lab for analysis. Within days, the results confirmed a perfect match with the DNA collected from J.B. Beasley's clothing 20 years earlier. The case, once frozen in uncertainty, was finally pointing to a specific individual. McCraney was arrested and charged with multiple counts of capital murder, including charges tied to the deaths of both J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett. News of the arrest sent shockwaves through Ozark and the surrounding Wiregrass region, where residents had followed the case closely for years. For the families of the victims, it was an overwhelming moment, blending relief, disbelief, and hope that justice would finally be served. This breakthrough highlighted the evolving power of forensic science, demonstrating how preserving evidence and embracing new technologies could revive cases that had long been considered unsolvable. The meticulous work of genealogists and investigators showed that even decades-old crimes could be solved when patience and innovation intersect. The Ozark community, while still grieving, began to see a path forward, a chance for answers that had seemed impossible for 20 years. With the identification of Coley McCraney, law enforcement shifted from decades of uncertainty to active preparation for prosecution. Investigators gathered further supporting evidence, confirmed timelines, and documented connections between McCraney and the victims. Each new piece reinforced the case, ensuring that when the trial began, it would rest on solid, irrefutable proof. The stage was set for the next chapter in this long and haunting story, where the wheels of justice would finally begin to turn. The trial of Coley Lewis McCraney began in April of 2023, nearly 24 years after the tragic deaths of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett. Courtrooms in Dale County were filled with family members, community members, and media, all bearing witness to a case that had haunted the region for decades. The prosecution focused heavily on the DNA evidence, which conclusively linked McCraney to the crime scene. They also presented timelines and witness statements to establish his proximity to the girls on the night of July 31st, 1999. During the proceedings, McCraney took the stand in his own defense, a surprising move that captured the attention of everyone present. He acknowledged knowing J.B. Beasley, but claimed that he had never harmed her or Tracie Hawlett. McCraney suggested that interactions with Beasley on that day were consensual and denied any involvement in the murders. His defense highlighted his previously clean record and community role as a truck driver and preacher, attempting to cast doubt on his culpability. The prosecution countered by emphasizing that the DNA match was absolute, showing that McCraney's genetic material was present on J.B. Beasley's clothing. Experts explained the significance of genetic genealogy and the meticulous process that had identified him as the suspect. Witness testimony and investigative records painted a clear picture of McCraney's location and actions in the hours leading up to the girl's disappearance. While McCraney's claims were considered, the evidence presented left little room for alternative explanations. After a 9-day trial, the jury of 12 deliberated for approximately 7 hours. The community, following closely through media coverage, awaited the verdict with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. On April 26th, 2023, the jury returned a unanimous decision, finding Coley Lewis McCraney guilty on 4 counts of capital murder. The families of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett, who had endured decades of uncertainty, finally had a measure of closure. The sentencing followed shortly thereafter. McCraney was given life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never have the opportunity to harm another person. In July of 2023, a Dale County Circuit Judge denied McCraney's appeal for a new trial. While legal proceedings could continue at higher courts, the verdict represented a decisive conclusion at the state level. The trial illustrated the remarkable evolution of forensic science and law enforcement techniques over the past 2 decades. It also underscored the perseverance of the families and investigators who refused to let the case fade into obscurity. Public attention and media coverage helped maintain pressure on authorities, reminding everyone that even cold cases could be solved. For the people of Ozark and the surrounding Wiregrass region, the trial marked the beginning of a long-awaited reckoning. Though justice was delivered, the impact of the murders on the community remained profound. Memorials and tributes continued to honor the lives of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett. Schools, churches, and local organizations remembered them not only for the tragedy of their deaths, but also for the vibrant young lives they had lived. The trial closed a chapter, but the story of their memory continued to resonate throughout the southern Alabama. With the conviction of Coley Lewis McCraney in 2023, the decade-seized long search for justice for J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett finally reached its conclusion. The verdict brought a sense of relief to the families, who had carried the burden of uncertainty for nearly 24 years. While the pain of losing their daughters could never be erased, the community took solace in knowing that the person responsible was held accountable. McCraney began serving his sentence at William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility, maximum security prison in Alabama. His appeals have been denied at the state level, and any future motions would face significant legal hurdles. The outcome of the case reinforced the idea that persistent investigation, combined with modern forensic science, could solve even the coldest of cases. Genetic genealogy, in particular, proved to be a transformative tool, helping to identify McCraney when conventional databases failed. The story of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett became a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the impact of violent crime on a community. In Ozark, Alabama, memorials and tributes have been established to honor their memory. Local schools and organizations often remember the girls on anniversaries, keeping their legacy alive. Community leaders emphasize that while justice can take time, dedication and persistence can eventually bring closure. National media coverage, including programs such as America's Most Wanted, Haunting Evidence, and On the Case with Paula Zahn, highlighted the case over the years. These profiles brought attention not only to the specific crime, but also to the challenges faced by investigators in long unsolved cases. They also served as reminders of the importance of technological advancements in solving violent crimes. Through these stories, the lives of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett continued to resonate far beyond their hometown. Ultimately, the murders of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett left an indelible mark on southern Alabama. The case illustrates both the devastating consequences of violent crime and the enduring power of perseverance and innovation in law enforcement. While nothing can restore the lives lost, the resolution provides the families and the community with a sense of justice fulfilled. The story of these 2 young women is now remembered not only for the tragedy, but also for the relentless pursuit of truth that ensured their story would not be forgotten. On the evening of Monday, October 31st, 2005, Athens, Alabama was quiet. Families were out trick-or-treating, porches were decorated with pumpkins, and for most people, it was a normal Halloween night. But in a small home on Market Street, a call came through to emergency services, that would soon reveal a crime both shocking and confusing. The voice on the line belonged to Charles Newman, an 80-year-old man and a decorated World War II veteran. He could be heard telling someone, "Don't do that," and leave me alone. In the background, another voice kept repeating the same strange question, "Where's the vault?" Then the call suddenly went silent. Police officers were sent to the home within minutes. They discovered that Newman had been attacked, and there were clear signs of a violent struggle. Yet something about the scene stood out. Nothing in the house suggested hidden treasure or secret wealth. What the intruder had been searching for seemed to exist only in his mind. Not long after, another call came into dispatch, but this time from a very different location. At a convenience store miles away, a young man used a payphone to ask for an ambulance. He had been shot and needed help immediately. That young man was 22-year-old Andrew Reid Lackey. He was treated for his injury at Huntsville Hospital, but investigators quickly began connecting his wound to the earlier 911 call. Within hours, the two events would merge into one case that would puzzle Alabama for years to come. When police arrived at Huntsville Hospital on Halloween night, they already had reason to believe Andrew Reid Lackey was connected to the murder of Charles Newman. Lackey was being treated for a gunshot wound, and officers quickly matched the timing of his injury with Newman's frantic 911 call. Once he was released from care, Lackey was immediately taken into custody. Investigators soon pieced together what had happened inside the Limestone County home. Newman's grandson had previously told Lackey about a vault supposedly hidden in the house, filled with gold bars and stacks of cash. Driven by that rumor, Lackey broke into the residence on October 31st. Newman confronted him, and according to court records, Lackey demanded over and over to know, "Where's the vault?" During the struggle, Newman fired his own gun and wounded Lackey. What followed was a brutal attack. Newman was stabbed dozens of times and also shot with his own weapon. The scene left investigators certain that the crime was not random, but instead a targeted attempt to find something that likely never existed. The evidence against Lackey piled up quickly. His blood was found inside the home. The 911 call captured both his voice and Newman's final words, and he was caught seeking medical help immediately after the crime. Authorities charged him with capital murder committed during both a burglary and a robbery, along with additional counts of burglary and robbery. As the investigation unfolded, questions began to surface not only about what Lackey had done, but also about who he was. Friends and family described him as socially withdrawn, unusual, and at times disconnected. Soon his mental health would become one of the most debated aspects of the case. Andrew Reid Lackey's trial began with the weight of overwhelming evidence against him. Prosecutors laid out a clear timeline: a break-in on Halloween night, a violent confrontation, and the brutal killing of Charles Newman. The 911 recording placed Lackey at the scene. His blood matched the injury Newman inflicted with his gun, and his own words revealed his motive: the search for a vault that likely never existed. Lackey faced charges of capital murder during a burglary and capital murder during a robbery, along with additional burglary and robbery counts. These charges made him eligible for the death penalty under Alabama law. The defense, however, did not pursue an insanity plea. Instead, they argued that Lackey's mental state should be taken into consideration. Psychologist Frank Preston testified that Lackey was socially awkward and displayed traits consistent with autism spectrum disorder. He was described as having difficulty connecting with others, rigid patterns of behavior, and an inability to grasp social cues. Despite these signs, Preston concluded that Lackey did not suffer from any severe mental illness that would impair his ability to understand right from wrong. The defense suggested that Lackey's condition made him vulnerable to manipulation, particularly by Newman's grandson, who had planted the story of hidden gold and money inside the house. Yet, the jury ultimately saw the case as one of calculated violence rather than diminished responsibility. After hearing the evidence, the jury convicted Lackey on all charges. The verdict set the stage for the penalty phase, where the question was no longer whether he had committed the crime, but whether he should spend his life in prison or face execution. As the trial closed, a haunting image remained. An 80-year-old World War II veteran, brutally murdered in his own home, and a young man with a troubled mind, now condemned by the law. After his conviction, Andrew Reid Lackey faced a choice that most death row inmates struggle with for years: whether to fight against execution or to accept it. Unlike many others, Lackey chose to waive most of his appeals. His decision left many observers unsettled, as it raised questions about his mental state and whether he truly understood the gravity of what he was choosing. The Equal Justice Initiative, a nonprofit legal organization based in Montgomery, argued that Lackey's refusal to pursue appeals was a reflection of his struggles with mental health. They maintained that his difficulties with social interaction, his rigid thought patterns, and his vulnerability to suggestion should have been taken more seriously during the trial and sentencing. Despite these arguments, courts allowed his execution to move forward. On July 25th of 2013, at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, Lackey was put to death by lethal injection. He was 29 years old. Witnesses reported that he had no final words before the execution began. The process was carried out swiftly, with the official time of death recorded a few minutes after 9 o'clock in the evening. For the family of Charles Newman, an elderly World War II veteran who had survived battle overseas only to be murdered in his own home, the execution brought a measure of closure. Yet, for others, the case left behind troubling questions. Was Lackey fully accountable for his actions, or had his mental condition and manipulation by others driven him to commit the crime? The murder of Charles Newman and the execution of Andrew Reid Lackey remain a dark chapter in Alabama's criminal history. The story highlights not only the brutality of the crime itself, but also the difficult balance between justice, punishment, and compassion for those who may not fully understand the consequences of their choices. In the end, Lackey's decision to end his own appeals sealed his fate. His case stands as a reminder of how desperation, vulnerability, and violence can intersect to create tragedy on both sides of the crime.